They found his teeth before they found his name. Blood still steamed in the gutter under the flickering streetlight, pooling like spilled secrets. Mason Kane said, "It wasn't supposed to happen here." His hands shook, not from the cold, but from the betrayal curling inside him like a knife. The rain came harder, each drop a drumbeat against the city's silence, masking the scrape of footsteps retreating into the alley. A black sedan idled at the curb, engine purring like a predator ready to strike. "We move now," he whispered to Claire, her eyes wide, coat clinging to her in the storm. She didn't answer, just stared at the crimson trail disappearing down the sewer grate. The night smelled of copper and gasoline. Somewhere far off, a siren wailed, too late to matter, too soon to hide. Mason thought of the man they'd lost, the deal they'd ruined, and the face he'd seen in the window a second before the gunfire. The one face he never thought he'd see again. The safe house stank of damp concrete and unspoken truths. Claire paced like a caged animal, boots thudding softly against the warped floorboards. Mason sat on the edge of a torn couch, eyes fixed on a map spread across the table, rainwater dripping from his jacket. He said, "We're not waiting for them to make the next move." Claire's voice cracked as she replied, "We don't even know who's alive." A single light bulb swung overhead, shadows sliding along the peeling walls. Somewhere in the city their enemies were celebrating, toasting the chaos they'd unleashed. Mason traced a route with his finger, stopping at a warehouse circled in red. His jaw tightened. The streets had taken his brother, his trust, and now his patience. The warehouse loomed like a sleeping beast, its rusted doors breathing cold air into the night. Mason said, "They think we're scared." Claire kept her hand on the pistol hidden beneath her coat, eyes scanning the empty lot. The moonlight cut harsh silver lines across the cracked pavement. A stray dog trotted past, pausing to sniff the air before vanishing into shadows. The sound of distant laughter drifted from inside, muffled by metal and secrecy. Mason's heart pounded, not from fear but from the clarity that only comes before violence. Inside, the air was thick with oil and dust, the kind that clings to your lungs. Mason led the way through rows of forgotten crates, the beam of his flashlight cutting thin paths through the dark. Claire whispered, "We're not alone." A shadow slipped between two stacks, gone before Mason could raise his weapon. The creak of metal echoed overhead. Somewhere above them, something, or someone, moved. The tension wrapped around Mason's ribs like barbed wire. The shot came without warning, a flash that burned white against the dark. Mason dove behind a crate, Claire hitting the ground beside him. Splinters rained down like wooden shrapnel. "They knew we were coming," Mason growled, chambering around. Footsteps pounded above, a cruel rhythm that promised more to come. The warehouse had become a hunting ground, and they weren't holding the rifle. Dawn scraped a pale line across the warehouse skylights, while smoke curled from bullet-chipped steel. Mason said, "We leave with proof, or we don't leave." Claire eased up from cover, eyes flaring as footsteps faded along the catwalk. She said, "They were stalling us, not killing us." The floor glittered with broken glass like coated stars, and a laptop bag lay half-hidden under a tarp peak. Mason tore it open and found a burner rig with a titanium ledger, cold to the touch. He said, "This is the vault key they fought to keep." Claire plugged the drive into a cracked tablet that booted with a ghostly hum. She said, "Wallet clusters, obfuscated hops, and a name that keeps repeating." The name was Hale Digital Transit, a shell that stole freight invoices and laundered crypto through phantom carriers. Mason felt the old ache stir when the ledger showed a payment time-stamped at the hour his brother died. They ditched the car under an overpass and took a rideshare 2 blocks shy of Claire's apartment. The city smelled of wet asphalt and burned coffee as commuters dragged Monday behind them. Mason said, "We ghost in and torch anything that can be traced." Claire's mouth thinned as she glanced at a black SUV idling too long near the curb. She said, "Either we're paranoid or we're late to our own funeral." The elevator groaned to the 4th floor, doors opening on a hallway, lined with dead plants and cheap cameras. Their lock was clean, but the doorframe wore new scars. Mason said, "They swept us." Inside, the air was wrong, and the desk lamp was angled toward the window like a signal flag. Claire found a pinhole mic under the chair rail and a sticker with a QR code that reeked of trap. She said, "Welcome to Hale's Hospitality Suite." Detective Erin Walsh waited at a corner diner with steam hugging the ceiling like old secrets. She was mid-40s with a calm that cut glass, and a badge she didn't need to show. Walsh said, "Your brother's file is a mess by design." Mason felt the table tremble under his hands as memories tried to claw through. He said, "Hale Digital Transit paid for the hit and paid to bury the case." Claire slid the ledger across the formica, the screen veined with rain reflections. She said, "Follow the freight, follow the fake drivers, land on a ghost terminal by the docks." Walsh didn't touch the tablet, but her gaze pinned it like evidence on a corkboard. She said, "If I move, Internal Affairs moves faster, and Hale owns the stopwatch." Mason tasted bitterness that wasn't the coffee when the bell over the door chimed and a courier left a sealed envelope on the counter. He said, "We are already on the clock." The envelope held a single photo of a cargo yard and a time stamped for tonight. Claire said, "They want us there or want us dead there." Mason traced the cranes like jagged teeth against a bruised sky and felt the pull of inevitability. He said, "We take the fight, but we do it smarter than they expect." They rented a storage unit and stripped their phones to skeletons, soldering jumpers and printing blank NFC tags. The room buzzed with cheap fluorescent light and the click of zip ties closing like cuffs. Claire said, "We see decoys, bounce location beacons, and spoof driver badges." Mason loaded magazines, each slide racking like punctuation to the plan. He said, "No hero shots, no speeches, just entries and exits." The ledger bled a new alert that crawled across the screen with a silent threat. It said funds had shifted to a cold wallet named Blackwater Stage. Night folded over the docks and turned the water into a sheet of hammered obsidian. Freight containers made canyons that whispered with diesel and salt. Mason said, "We move on the minute." Claire adjusted a cloned badge that blinked approval like a liar's smile. She said, "If we die, at least we die breaking their math." The yard map matched the photo, and the camera towers winked with lazy confidence. A forklift trundled past, masking their footsteps in its guttural purr. Mason saw the ghost terminal, a prefab office on stilts with tinted glass and a heartbeat of servers. He said, "Hale is inside the wire and asleep at the switch." The door gave under Claire's pick, and cold air breathed across racks that glowed like digital stained glass. The ledger connected, and a transfer queue uncoiled like a serpent tasting heat. Server fans screamed like insects as the queue hissed open and bled numbers into the dark. Mason said, "Cut their arteries, not the skin." Claire ghosted through the console, her cloned badge blinking a saint's lie. She said, "Blackwater Stage routes to 7 cold vaults and 2 charities." The map unfurled, a constellation of ports, churches, and shell schools that sold mercy by the ton. Mason felt his brother's name pound behind his ribs like a door begging to be kicked. He said, "Hale doesn't move money, he moves absolution." A soft chime warned of an inbound audit that smelled like corporate teeth. Claire said, "We mirror their wallet, then salt it with a trace." The screen jittered as if a hand tugged the wire from the other side. Walsh texted a single order that burned. "Out now." Mason slashed the power, pocketed the ledger, and tasted metal as breakers died. They hit the catwalk and the night punched back with sirens and gulls. Mason said, "South fence, blind zone, move." Claire dropped 2 decoy beacons that chirped like counterfeit hearts. She said, "Let their cameras chase ghosts." A forklift shrieked as a guard spotted the open door and radioed doom across the yard. Mason fired a warning that shattered a floodlight into oily snow. He said, "No dead men tonight." Tires screamed where the SUV from the apartment fishtailed between containers. Claire snapped the badge to a gate reader, and the lock clacked like a coin flip. She said, "We earned this exit." They slid through steam and diesel and fear before the alarms found their names. And behind them, the server office pulsed like a wounded lighthouse. The safe house breathed like a lung after a sprint, hot and thin. Walsh arrived without her badge, and with eyes that refused to blink. "Walsh," said Internal, "is sniffing your footprints across the docks." Mason felt anger coil, but he kept it leashed like a dog that knows its owner. He said, "Hale uses churches and schools as laundries and calls it grace." Claire wiped rain from the ledger and forced a smile that never reached bone. She said, "We ghost copied their vault, and the trace rides inside the tithe." Walsh slid a photo across the table, a younger Mason shaking hands with a councilman at a charity gala. Walsh said, "They will say you were part of it." The room tilted as the past tried to buy the present with an old suit. Mason said, "They can rent my face, not my hands." Outside, tires whispered like threats. They hunted for proof in the bones of Mason's old life and found a locker that still smelled like gasoline. Mason said, "He kept the keys where the city never looks." Claire pried the lid of a dented toolbox and lifted a phone wrapped in church bulletins. She said, "Voicemail cache, locked by grief and habit." A scrape of metal yielded a dog tag etched with a hymn number and a date. Mason felt time stagger when the date matched his father's burial. He said, "He was sending me back to the dirt to find the truth." The phone flickered awake and offered a single unsent draft addressed to Walsh. It read like a confession and a map, all harm and hope. Claire said, "Your brother wanted the light, not the heat." The locker shut like a verdict. They followed the hymn number to a riverside chapel where the lights burned too bright for midnight. Mason said, "Hale bought the roof and the sermon." Claire laughed once like a broken light bulb and tucked the phone into her sleeve. She said, "The money was gone. The loyalty was gone. Now, all he had was the gun." A janitor waved them through with a nod that felt rehearsed, and incense failed to hide the scent of toner. The office held printers, routers, and boxes labeled relief. Mason opened a crate and found gift envelopes pre-loaded with clean history. He said, "This is their absolution farm." A door clicked behind them like a small nail being set. Claire turned, and two men in choir coats smiled without warmth. She said, "We brought the wrong prayers." The lights cut, and the room inhaled. The lights came back in a blink that felt rehearsed, and the choir coats were gone, replaced by two men in tactical black. Mason said, "They're not here to sing." Claire's pulse thudded in her throat as she slid the ledger into her coat lining. She said, "We walk out or we never leave." The taller man reached for a hymnal, but the paper hid the steel of a suppressed pistol. Mason knocked the hymnal away, sending psalms and brass castings to the floor. The other man moved like a blade through the incense haze, but Claire's elbow cracked his jaw with a wet pop. She said, "Wrong prayer, right punch." A pew bench toppled under their combined weight as Mason shoved the first man into a cabinet of baptismal robes. The room stank of mothballs and gun oil. Somewhere beyond the stained glass, a bell began to toll. Midnight had called in its debt. They burst into the nave, stained glass bleeding moonlight across pews like shattered confessions. Mason said, "Front doors, move." Claire vaulted the altar rail, her breath fogging in the cold draft that cut through the church. She said, "They'll choke the exits." A shadow rose in the gallery, rifle braced, scope glinting like a second moon. Mason dove behind a column as the first round turned a hymn board into splinters. He said, "We're not staying for the chorus." Claire's pistol barked twice, shattering the scope's light and driving the shooter back. The echo swallowed the silence and returned it twice as loud. Somewhere in the rafters, footsteps shifted like restless saints. The candlelight trembled in its own fear. The vestry door slammed shut behind them, cloaking them in the musk of old incense and wax. Mason said, "We need the crypt exit." Claire's flashlight skimmed over vestments and a ladder to the bell tower. She said, They'll expect us to run low, so we go high. The ladder groaned under their weight, each rung dusting their hands with the past. The tower stairs spiraled into darkness, wind keening through gaps like a warning. Mason's breath came ragged, boots scraping stone, the city's sodium glow bleeding through slits in the wall. Claire reached the hatch first, shoving it open into a gust that slapped their faces raw. Below, headlights pooled in the courtyard like eyes waiting for the fall. Mason said, "Jumps cleaner than capture." They dropped into the graveyard like shadows loosed from their anchors. Mason rolled behind a granite angel, its wings eroded by decades of rain. Claire hit the ground with a grunt, scanning rows of tilted stones for movement. She said, 2 o'clock. Muzzle flash popped near a crypt, bullets chewing marble. Mason fired back, his rounds sparking off iron fence posts. The night smelled of wet soil and cordite, each breath dragging cold into their lungs. Claire signaled toward a service gate barely visible through the fog. He nodded, and they moved in low bursts, ghosts among the graves. Somewhere behind, the bell began its second toll. The service gate groaned open onto an alley slick with rain and lined with dumpsters. Mason said, "They'll follow the shots, not the silence." Claire holstered her weapon and pulled the ledger from her coat, its screen cracked but still glowing. She said, "We lost half the trace, but the core is intact." The alley reeked of diesel and old food, a rat skittering ahead like a scout. Mason's phone buzzed with a number he hadn't seen since before the funeral. He said, "It's him." The voice on the other end was calm, almost warm. "You should have stayed out of my churches." The line died, leaving only the hiss of rain and the sense that every step forward was into someone else's plan. The ledger's cracked glow painted their faces in fractured light as they ducked into a shuttered pawn shop. Mason said, "We use what we have, not what we lost." Claire kicked aside a crate of broken radios and dropped her coat, revealing a shoulder rig loaded with fresh mags. She said, "Hale's servers won't stay blind forever." The shop reeked of dust and desperation, shelves sagging under relics nobody wanted. Mason found an old police scanner, its static whispering the city's heartbeat. A channel broke through with dispatch chatter about unmarked bodies and dockside explosions. Claire caught his eye and said, "They're moving faster than we thought." Mason set the scanner down, loading his pistol with a click that sounded like a closing door. He said, "Then we move faster than they can bleed." The street outside steamed under the weight of rain, and Mason's boots splashed through puddles that mirrored neon like fractured glass. Claire said, "We'll need eyes at the yard before sunrise." Mason nodded toward an overpass where 2 figures smoked under a burnt-out light. He said, "Not all allies wear badges." They approached the men, dockhands with salt in their beards and wariness in their eyes. Mason slid a folded photo across, the image of the ghost terminal glowing under a security flood. One of the dockhands said, "You're not the first to come for him, but you might be the last." Claire's grip on her pistol tightened under her coat. She said, "Tell us where the rot starts." The dockhand exhaled smoke like a slow surrender and pointed toward Pier 19. Pier 19 slept under the guard of stacked containers, their sides painted with the graffiti of forgotten crews. Mason said, "We keep it clean unless they don't." Claire slipped between rows, her footsteps muffled by the rain-slick asphalt. She said, 2 cameras on the east, 3 drones on the roof." The air was a mixture of salt, diesel, and low-tide decay. Mason spotted a forklift idling near a lit container, the hum of its engine too steady for an abandoned yard. A shadow stepped out from behind it, raising a silenced carbine. Mason dropped low, firing twice and driving the shooter behind cover. Claire moved with precision, her muzzle flash briefly painting the rain gold. She said, "Alarm in 3, 2. The siren's wail swallowed her voice. They broke into the lit container, the air inside thick with warm circuitry and humming fans. Mason said, "It's a mobile hub. Hale's running his net on wheels." Claire yanked a hard drive the size of a brick and dropped it into her pack. She said, encrypted, "But it'll crack if we feed it enough heat." A faint beep drew Mason's eyes to the floor. A trip sensor, too late to disarm. The container door slammed, and locking bolts sank like a coffin lid. Claire said, "We're boxed in." Mason grabbed a pry bar, wedging it against the latch, muscles straining as alarms blare. Outside, boots pounded on wet steel. Inside, the hum of servers turned into the growl of cooling fans, overworked and angry. The latch gave with a scream, and they spilled into the open just as headlights flared from the far end of the pier. Mason said, "Go." Claire sprinted toward a forklift, hot-wiring it with the speed of someone who'd done worse. She said, "We make our own exit." Mason jumped onto the side rail as she gunned it, the machine's tires skidding on slick asphalt. The pursuing SUV's grille split the rain ahead like a predator's grin. Mason fired into the windshield, spiderwebbing the glass and forcing the driver to swerve. Claire rammed the forklift through a chain-link fence, sparks flying as steel tore. She said, "Tell me that's the last one." Mason glanced over his shoulder and saw more lights cresting the pier. He said, "It's never the last one." The forklift's engine coughed its last breath in a dim freight tunnel beneath the pier. Mason said, "We finish this above ground." Claire wiped rain from her face, her breath shaking in the cold. She said, "Hale's not going to hide behind glass anymore." The tunnel walls were lined with graffiti, chipped tiles glistening from decades of runoff. They followed the echo of distant generators, each step bringing them closer to the hum of Hale's private hub. Mason's mind clawed at the memory of his brother's funeral, the suit he wore, the stranger's smile in the crowd. The hum grew teeth, an armored server bunker wrapped in chain link and razor wire. Claire said, "We cut the head, or the body grows back." Mason drew his pistol, the weight settling into his hand like a final choice. The chain link rattled as Mason's cutters bit through, each snap echoing like a starting pistol. Claire kept watch, her eyes tracking the shadows between generators. She said, "One guard, west side, heavy shotgun." Mason nodded, slipping along the fence until the guard's silhouette filled his sights. The man never saw the muzzle flash, the report swallowed by the generator's roar. Claire dragged the body out of sight, her face unreadable. She said, "You're colder than I thought." Mason didn't answer, just pushed the gate open. Inside, server towers glowed in neat, silent rows, their fans whispering secrets to each other. In the far corner, a glass office overlooked the floor, and in that office, Hale waited with a drink in his hand. Hale's face was older, sharper than Mason remembered, but the smile was the same one from the funeral. Hale said, "You always were chasing the wrong ghost." Mason stepped into the office, pistol steady, the ledger in his free hand. He said, "You killed him for the money, then used me to clean the blood." Hale swirled his drink, amber catching the server light. "No, Mason. I killed him because he sold me to the feds," Hale said, voice like silk hiding barbed wire. Claire kept to the shadows, circling behind Hale's desk. She said, "Then this ledger makes you the feds' next prize." Hale's gaze flicked toward her, and Mason saw the tell, a finger tightening on something under the desk. The desk drawer yawned, and Hale's hand emerged with a compact pistol. Mason fired first, the shot tearing through the glass wall and dropping Hale sideways into his chair. Claire swept the weapon away and grabbed the ledger from Mason's grip. She said, "We burn it now, or we become him." Mason stared at Hale's still body, the half-spilled drink staining the carpet. He said, "No, this ends in the light." They stepped into the server rows, Mason plugging the ledger into the main console. The screens bloomed with numbers, names, and accounts, a ledger of every betrayal Hale ever bought. Claire watched as Mason sent it all into a secure channel with Walsh's badge number at the header. Sirens bloomed in the distance, weaving with the hum of the servers. Mason said, "We walk out before those lights turn into cell bars." Claire nodded, slipping her hand into her coat pocket as they crossed the threshold. Outside, the rain was steady, washing glass and blood into the gutter. Walsh's unmarked sedan rolled to a stop, her eyes catching on the glow of the ledger through Mason's coat. She said, "You just made enemies you can't count." Mason stepped past her, voice flat. Then, They'll have to get in line. Claire didn't look back, her shadow stretching long under the sodium street lamps. Somewhere, a bell tolled once, and the night swallowed it whole. The city was quieter than it should have been, for a night that ended with sirens. Mason stood under a flickering streetlight, steam curling from a manhole like the city exhaling its sins. Claire leaned against the sedan, the ledger now wrapped in plain brown paper. She said, "Walsh will either bury it or burn it." Mason looked at her, rain trailing from his brow. He said, "It's not ours anymore, it's bait." Somewhere in the dark, a camera shutter clicked, too far away to catch. Claire glanced toward the sound but didn't move. She said, "We've traded one hunter for another." Mason's shadow stretched toward the curb, longer than it should be, as if someone else was standing just out of sight. They drove until the skyline shrank into a smear of neon in the rear view. Point. Mason said, "You could disappear with what's in that paper." Claire's lips curved, but it wasn't a smile. She said, "And you could run until the street forgets your name." The highway was a black ribbon, the white lines sliding under their wheels like whispered promises. Mason's hands tightened on the wheel as rain smeared the windshield into abstract ghosts. A green highway sign flashed past. One more turn and I'd be nowhere anyone cared to look. Claire said, "You ever think about stopping?" Mason didn't answer, but the wipers kept time like a metronome for the dead. They pulled into a roadside motel with peeling paint and a vacancy sign that buzzed like a bad memory. Mason said, "One night. Then we vanish." Claire unlocked the room, the smell of bleach and cigarette smoke heavy in the air. She dropped the package onto the table, the paper darkened where rain had bled through. Mason sat on the bed, the springs groaning like old bones. He said, "Hale's people will want it back before morning." Claire opened the curtain just enough to see the lot. A lone car idled by the dumpster, its exhaust curling like an invitation. She said, "We're not alone." The knock came soft, almost polite. Mason rose, pistol already in hand. He said, "Stay behind me." Claire moved toward the bathroom door, her eyes never leaving the window. A man's voice spoke from the other side of the door, calm, measured. "I'm here for what's mine." Mason stepped back, choosing silence over reply. The knob turned, slow as a clock's second hand, until the deadbolt caught. The voice laughed, low and without humor. "There's no retirement plan for ghosts," it said. Mason motioned to Claire, and together they slipped out the back into the rain, leaving the door locked and the lights burning. They walked into the night with nothing but the ledger and the knowledge it carried. The rain eased, leaving the road ahead slick and shining under scattered street lamps. Mason said, "We'll never be finished." Claire's voice was softer than he'd heard it all night. She said, "Then we keep moving until we are." In the distance, the sound of an approaching engine grew, but they didn't look back. Their figures blurred into the mist, two silhouettes swallowed by the space between the lights. The ledger was heavy in Claire's hand, but it wasn't the weight of money. It was the weight of every name still alive inside it.